India's southern state of Kerala became the center of one of the country's most disturbing criminal cases, a story that received enormous attention in 2019 and 2020, and eventually became widely known as the Cyanide Killer. In the Cudahy area, a family of 10 experienced a series of unexplained deaths, with 6 members dying over a period of roughly 14 years.
And the murky Kerala cyanide murder cases have created ripples in the state. Many find it hard to believe that a woman known to be family-oriented, well-respected and liked could be a cold-blooded killer, and the police are finding it hard to contain the crowds as they take the suspect around to reconstruct the crime.
On top of the walls, on the streets, hundreds of people gathered all around in rural Kozhikode, booing, shouting. Wanting to get a glimpse of 47-year-old Jolly Joseph, suspected of killing 6 members of a family over the span of 14 years, which includes her former husband's as well as her current husband's families.
Among the victims was a 2-year-old girl named Alfine. At the time, most of these deaths were considered natural, with sudden heart attacks or similar medical complications being given as the likely causes. For years, nobody seriously questioned whether something more sinister could have been happening inside the family. What made the case even more disturbing was that only one of the 6 bodies was subjected to a forensic examination during that entire period. Years later, when investigators began taking another look at the deaths, that examination became an important part of the mystery and raised questions about possible poisoning. As the investigation moved forward, one woman increasingly came into focus: Jolly Joseph. On the surface, she appeared to have lived an ordinary and respectable life, but investigators would eventually begin questioning different parts of her story, her relationships, and her connection to the deaths. The central question was no longer simply how these people had died, but whether someone had deliberately caused their deaths, and if so, why. The mystery began to unfold publicly on October 4, 2019, when investigators arrived at a cemetery near Lord Madha Church in Cudahy. The place was far more crowded than usual. Police officers, cameramen, news reporters, and ambulances had gathered around the cemetery. Near the entrance, a witness stood alongside the police, pointing toward a group of graves. Based on the information being provided, investigators began opening 6 graves belonging to members of the same family. The graves were positioned close to one another, and as each one was opened, police carefully documented the process. The witness helped identify the people buried there by giving their names and dates of death. The first grave belonged to Anama Thomas, who had died in 2002. Almost 17 years had passed since her burial, so there were no recognizable remains left in the grave, only bones. But Anama's death was significant because she was the first member of the Thomas family to die in what would eventually be recognized as a disturbing sequence. Even Anama's final moments had been unusual. One day, she had been outside her home before returning inside. After drinking a glass of water, she suddenly began feeling sick. She became dizzy, struggled to stay on her feet, and eventually collapsed near the entrance of the house. Her family rushed her to the hospital, where doctors concluded that she had suffered a heart attack. Given her age, the explanation did not initially seem unusual enough to raise suspicion. There was no immediate indication of foul play, so her family accepted the diagnosis and eventually buried her. Then, 6 years later in 2008, another member of the family died. This time it was Tom Thomas, who was 65 years old. His death followed a remarkably similar pattern. Tom suddenly became unwell while inside his room. He wasn't doing anything physically demanding when his condition changed. He collapsed from his bed and was rushed to the hospital, but doctors could not save him. His exact cause of death was not completely clear to the family, but because Anama had died several years earlier in a similar manner, they assumed that Tom had suffered from a sudden medical condition as well. Tom was brought home and buried beside Anama. Still, nobody was looking at the 2 deaths as part of a larger pattern. As far as the family knew, 2 older relatives had died from what appeared to be natural medical causes. That changed in 2011, when the 3rd member of the family died. This time, it was Roy Thomas, the son of Anama and Tom. Roy was considerably younger than his parents, and had no known history of serious health problems. Yet his final moments were strangely similar to theirs. He suddenly became dizzy, collapsed, and had to be taken to the hospital. Roy was still able to speak after becoming sick, but his condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died while being taken to the hospital. Now there had been 3 deaths in the same family, all involving sudden illness, dizziness, collapse, and death. The similarities were becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Roy's uncle, Matthew Mangiadillo, Anama's brother, was one of the first people to openly question what was happening. He began asking a disturbing but simple question: how could 3 members of the same family die in almost the exact same way? Anama and Tom were both older, but Roy was much younger and had no known medical history that could easily explain why he suddenly collapsed and died. For Matthew, that was enough to raise serious doubts. He became convinced that Roy's body needed to undergo a post-mortem examination, but not everyone in the family agreed with him. Several relatives tried to convince Matthew that the deaths could simply be tragic coincidences. They argued that death could come unexpectedly, and that there was no reason to assume someone had deliberately caused it. Among those who tried to calm Matthew's concerns were Silly and Jolly, both daughters-in-law of the family. Jolly, who was Roy's wife, also reportedly tried to convince Matthew that there was no need for a post-mortem. But Matthew refused to accept that explanation. He remained determined to find out what had actually happened to his nephew. Eventually, Matthew managed to get Roy's body examined. A post-mortem was conducted, but it did not immediately provide the clear answer he had been hoping for. The examination failed to establish a definite cause that could explain the unusual circumstances surrounding Roy's death, and investigators were unable to properly pursue the possibility of an unidentified poisonous substance at that stage. With no clear conclusion, Roy's death remained unresolved, but Matthew's suspicions did not disappear. If something had actually caused Roy's death, then there was another disturbing question that nobody could answer: who could have given him something poisonous? Then, in 2014, the family suffered 2 more deaths within a relatively short period. One of the victims was Matthew himself, the very person who had spent years questioning Roy's death. The other was a 2-year-old girl named Alphine, the daughter of Tom Thomas's brother's son. Matthew's death was particularly significant because he had been the person most determined to uncover the truth. He had questioned Roy's death, demanded a post-mortem, and refused to accept that 3 people from the same family could die in such similar circumstances. But when Matthew himself died, the situation was different. Because of his age, his death was considered natural, and no post-mortem was carried out. His body was eventually buried alongside the other family members. Then came the heartbreaking death of Alphine. She was the 2-year-old daughter of Sheju and Silly, and their first child. Unlike the earlier victims, Alphine's death did not initially appear to be connected to a heart attack. According to the account presented here, she was drinking water from a bottle when she suddenly choked and collapsed. She was only 2 years old, making her death especially difficult for everyone around the family to understand. There seemed to be no obvious reason why such a young child would suddenly die. The final death in this sequence came in 2016, when Silly Saiju, Alphine's mother, died 2 years after her daughter. Her death once again appeared strangely similar to those that had come before. She suddenly became unwell, collapsed, and died. By this point, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As Silly's remains were brought out of the cemetery, cameras continued flashing while reporters and investigators gathered around the graves. But behind all the media attention was one question that had been building for years. How had 6 members of the same family died under such suspiciously similar circumstances? Officially, the deaths had been treated as natural, but some relatives and neighbors had never been completely comfortable with that explanation. 6 members of one family had died over roughly 14 years, and several of them had experienced remarkably similar symptoms before their deaths. Something about the story simply did not add up. To understand why these deaths were so important, we first need to understand exactly how the Thomas family was connected. There were 10 members in the family, and their relationships would become extremely important as the investigation developed. At the center of the family were Tom Thomas and Anama Thomas. The couple had 2 sons, Roho Thomas and Roy Thomas. Roy lived in Kerala with his parents, while Roho had moved to the United States for his studies and eventually built his life there. Despite living abroad, Roho remained closely connected to his family. He regularly spoke with them over the phone and usually returned to Kerala once a year. Anama's brother was Matthew Mangiadillo, the same man who had insisted that Roy's death needed to be investigated. Tom's brother, Jakara, was also connected to the family, and Jakara had a son named Sheju. Sheju was married to Silly, and together they had a daughter, Alphine. Roy, meanwhile, was married to Jolly Ama Joseph, and the witness standing beside the police at the cemetery, identifying the names and dates of death of the victims, was Rojo. After watching members of his family die one after another, Rojo had returned from the United States determined to understand what had happened. 17 years had passed since the first death in 2002, but Rojo knew his family well. He believed that many of the people who had died had been healthy and active, and he could not accept that so many deaths could simply be unrelated natural events. When investigators asked Rojo what he believed had happened to his family, his answer was far more serious than anyone expected. He told them that he did not believe the deaths were natural. In his view, members of his family had been murdered, and he believed the person responsible could be someone from within the family itself. That suspicion brought investigators toward one of the most important people in the entire story, Jolly Ama Joseph. Before the deaths began, Jolly's life appeared almost perfect. She came from a financially comfortable family and had built a strong reputation in her community. People knew her as an academically successful woman who regularly attended church and participated in charity and social activities. She was considered well-presented, attractive, and highly educated, which made her seem like someone who had everything under control. According to the story, Jolly was so successful academically that she eventually claimed to have become a professor at NIT. Because she came from a wealthy family and had seemingly never struggled financially, some people in her neighborhood even assumed that her family connections might have helped her get the position. Jolly rejected that idea and maintained that she had earned her career through her own qualifications and abilities. From the outside, Jolly appeared to have an almost ideal life. She was educated, socially active, financially secure, and respected by the people around her. Roy Thomas also saw her in much the same way. In 1997, Roy and Jolly got married, after which Jolly moved into the Thomas family home with Roy and his parents, Tom and Anama. The Thomas family itself was financially well established. Several members were professionals, including professors and government employees, and they owned considerable property in the area. Although not everyone stayed in the same house permanently, the family remained closely connected. The large family home itself reflected their financial position and the amount of money they had invested in the property. Tom Thomas was an elected administrator, while Anama was a retired teacher, and both had played an important financial role in building and supporting the family home. But over the next 14 years, that family would experience one death after another. As the deaths continued, Jolly reportedly told people in the neighborhood that something was wrong with the house. She suggested that the family might have been affected by evil eyes or a curse, creating the impression that the repeated deaths were some kind of supernatural misfortune rather than something deliberate. At the time, nobody had enough evidence to seriously challenge that explanation. Years later, however, investigators would look back at those same events very differently. Then, in 2017, 6 years after Roy's death, Jolly decided to marry again. She was still in her early 30s. And her family supported her decision to start a new chapter in her life. But her choice of partner immediately made the situation more complicated. She wanted to marry Saju, who was Roy's cousin. Saju was not a close blood relative of Roy, but there was still a connection between the two families. More importantly, Saju already had a wife and a child. According to the account, Saju had liked Jolly for some time, and Jolly also appeared to have feelings for him. Eventually, in 2017, the two married despite opposition from some members of the family. Saju reportedly believed that both he and Jolly had been left alone after everything that had happened and that, with time, the family would eventually accept their relationship. Around the same time, Rojo was also back in Kerala. As you may remember, Rojo was the brother who had been living in the United States. While discussions about the family and the marriage were taking place, Rojo asked about his share of the family property. That was when Jolly told him something that immediately caught his attention. According to her, the entire house and property were now in her name. Rojo found that extremely strange. He remembered that his father's property was supposed to be divided between the three brothers. So he decided to check the family documents himself. What he discovered made his suspicions about Jolly even stronger. Tom Thomas had apparently changed his will only 3 months before his death. Under the earlier arrangement, the family property was understood to be divided between his 3 sons. But the new will reportedly transferred the house and certain properties to Jolly. For Rojo, one question immediately stood out. Why would his father suddenly change a will that had existed for years, just 3 months before his death? The change seemed especially suspicious to Rojo because it completely altered how the family property was supposed to be distributed. He began wondering whether Jolly had somehow influenced his father before his death. But when Rojo raised these concerns with the rest of the family, they did not support him. Instead, they accused him of being greedy and suggested that he was only questioning the will because he wanted the property for himself. They reminded him that Jolly had already lost her husband and had gone through years of tragedy, and they believed Rojo should show more respect rather than make accusations against her. Rojo insisted that he wasn't trying to take the entire estate. He simply wanted his father's original wishes to be respected and the property to be divided between the 3 brothers as it had been intended. Still, the property issue was only the beginning. Rojo had started paying much closer attention to Jolly. Something about her behavior, and the way she spoke to him made him feel that the woman she presented to the family might not be the person she really was. Instead of accepting the criticism from his relatives, Rojo decided to investigate Jolly's background himself. And what he discovered was something nobody in the family had expected. For years, Jolly had built her identity around one particular claim. She was a professor at NIT. According to the investigation, she maintained this story for nearly 17 years. When Rojo first heard that she might have been lying about her job, he found it difficult to believe. So instead of relying on assumptions, he decided to verify it himself. He went directly to NIT and started asking faculty members whether anyone named Jolly Joseph had ever worked there. The answer was consistent. No one knew her as a professor. Even the dean reportedly had no record or memory of Jolly Joseph working there. For Rojo, this discovery completely changed the way he looked at her. If Jolly had never actually been employed at NIT, then a much bigger question remained. Where had she been going every morning for all those years? Rojo continued looking into her daily routine and found that Jolly would sometimes visit the NIT campus, spend time around the campus or its canteen, and later return home. On other days, she would apparently visit shopping malls or other places before coming back. She had also purchased a separate flat where she reportedly spent considerable time. According to the investigation, she had even created documents connected to NIT, including a fake certificate and faculty identity card, to make her story appear genuine. That meant this wasn't simply a lie she had told once or twice. If the allegations were true, Jolly had maintained an elaborate false identity for years. She would leave home as if she were going to work, spend the day somewhere else, and then return home with a story about how her day had gone. When Roy was alive, he could ask about her work. Later, Sajid could ask her the same thing. Somehow, she had managed to keep the same story going for years without the people closest to her discovering the truth. But Rojo had another question. How was Jolly supporting this lifestyle? If she wasn't actually receiving a professor's salary, where was the money coming from? She had regular expenses, traveled, maintained another flat, and appeared to have enough money to continue living normally. Rojo looked into her finances, but at that stage, he couldn't find a clear explanation for the source of her money. Then his attention returned to something else that had been bothering him: the autopsy report of Roy Thomas. It was Matthew, Roy's uncle, who had originally pushed for Roy's post-mortem after his sudden death. Years later, when Rojo obtained the report, he noticed an apparently minor contradiction. The report stated that Roy had eaten rice and curry the night before his death. But Jolly had previously told the family that Roy hadn't eaten dinner that night, and hadn't even eaten anything that morning. On its own, that might have seemed like a small detail, but Rojo couldn't understand why Jolly would give a different account of something as simple as Roy's last meal. Then he noticed something far more significant in the report. According to the account, a poisonous substance had been detected in Roy's body, and the findings suggested that the substance had been present for a period of time rather than entering his body only shortly before his death. For Rojo, several separate pieces of the puzzle were now beginning to connect. The unexplained deaths, Jolly's inconsistent statements, the sudden change in Tom Thomas's will, her false claim about working at NIT, and the suspicious findings surrounding Roy's death. Rojo collected everything he had discovered and took it to the police. His allegations were serious enough for investigators to take another look at the family's history and reopen the case. And that brings us back to 2019, when the police returned to the cemetery and began examining the graves of the 6 deceased family members. Rojo was there, helping investigators identify the victims and explain their connection to one another. As part of the investigation, police also began comparing the different statements Jolly had given over the years. They noticed that her version of events wasn't always consistent. Details had changed, and in several accounts, Jolly appeared to place herself away from the victims around the time of their deaths. The more investigators questioned her, the more contradictions they reportedly found. According to the account presented here, police identified around 50 discrepancies in her statements. After nearly 2 decades of appearing to live an ordinary life, the story Jolly had maintained for years was beginning to unravel. By this point, the case had also become a major subject of Indian news coverage. The suspicious deaths, the cemetery investigation, the autopsy findings, and the allegations against Jolly were being discussed widely. With both media and public attention focused on the case, investigators faced increasing pressure to find out what had actually happened inside the Thomas family. And the biggest question remained, could the woman who appeared educated, respectable, well-mannered, and deeply involved with her family really have been connected to the deaths of several family members? If investigators were right, then the motive could be connected to something even more disturbing: control over the family and its property. After years of uncertainty, Jolly was subjected to intense questioning. She continued to maintain the version of events she had given between 2017 and 2019, but investigators kept confronting her with the contradictions they had uncovered. Eventually, according to the account, Jolly gave in and began revealing information that investigators believed could explain what had happened to the Thomas family. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. At the center of the Thomas household was Anama Thomas, the family's matriarch. She was considered a strong and authoritative figure, and according to the account, her decisions carried significant weight inside the family. After marrying Roy, Jolly had to live under Anama's influence. But according to the prosecution's theory, Jolly had begun to resent that control. She wanted more freedom and more influence within the household. Instead of openly challenging her mother-in-law, however, Jolly allegedly chose a different approach. She continued presenting herself as the ideal daughter-in-law. She helped with household work, prepared food for her in-laws, and maintained the image of someone who cared deeply about the family. But according to investigators, the food she prepared would eventually become a central part of the entire case. According to the prosecution's theory, the food Jolly prepared for the family eventually became one of the most important parts of the alleged plan. Investigators accused her of secretly mixing small quantities of potassium cyanide into meals. The chemical was allegedly obtained through a person connected to the jewelry business, where cyanide can be used in certain processes. The allegation was that Jolly knew how dangerous the substance could be and used it in a way that would make the deaths appear to be natural. According to investigators, Anama Thomas was the first person Jolly wanted out of her way. Anama had a strong influence over the household, and Jolly allegedly felt that as long as her mother-in-law remained in control, she would never have the position she wanted inside the family. Then came Roy Thomas, Jolly's own husband. According to the investigation, Jolly's relationship with Roy had changed over time. She allegedly became interested in Saju, Roy's cousin, and believed that he was more suited to the kind of partner she wanted. But simply leaving Roy and marrying Saju would have raised questions and damaged the image Jolly had carefully built around herself. So, according to the prosecution's theory, she chose a far darker solution and allegedly began planning Roy's death. Roy's death created another problem for Jolly. There was one person who had never accepted the idea that Roy had simply died naturally: Matthew Mangiadillo. Matthew had been the one who insisted on Roy's postmortem in the first place. Investigators later alleged that Matthew was also poisoned through food. If that allegation was true, it meant that the very man who had tried to uncover the truth about Roy had himself become another victim. But there was still one more obstacle in Jolly's way. After Roy's death, Jolly and Saju reportedly became increasingly close. Their meetings were noticed by Silly, Saju's wife. She apparently chose not to confront them directly, and instead took her daughter Alphine and kept her distance. Saju, meanwhile, was reportedly caught in a difficult situation. He had a wife and a young daughter, and even if he had feelings for Jolly, he still had responsibilities toward his existing family. According to the prosecution's theory, Jolly began seeing both Silly and Alfine as obstacles. Silly stood between her and the relationship she wanted with Saju, while Alfine represented an ongoing connection between Saju and his existing family. Then the deaths began happening closer together. In 2014, Matthew and 2-year-old Alfine died within months of each other. 2 years later, in 2016, Silly also died. Investigators later alleged that these deaths were connected to the same poisoning pattern. The gap between the earlier deaths had been measured in years, but now multiple members of the family were dying within a much shorter period. And the most disturbing part was that one of those alleged victims was only 2 years old. According to the prosecution, Jolly had become increasingly determined to remove anyone who stood between her and the life she wanted, whether the motive involved property, control, or her relationship with Saju. The alleged plan had started with members of the older generation, but eventually even a small child became part of the horrifying sequence of deaths. For years, however, nobody seemed to see a connection. Each death could be explained separately, and Jolly continued to appear like an ordinary member of the family. She attended family events, prepared food, maintained relationships, and remained close to the people around her. That was one of the reasons the case eventually became widely associated with the name Cyanide Case. After Jolly was arrested, public attention naturally shifted towards Saju. People wanted to know how someone who had eventually married Jolly could possibly have known nothing about what was allegedly happening around him. Saju denied having any knowledge of the murders. According to his account, the major secret he discovered after their marriage was actually Jolly's fake professional identity. Around 5 months after their wedding in 2017, he reportedly followed her one day when she was late for what he believed was work. He eventually discovered that she wasn't actually going to a college or university, as she had claimed. But Saju said he didn't confront her immediately. His family had already experienced years of deaths and emotional trauma, and he apparently didn't want to add another conflict to an already complicated situation. Whether Saju genuinely knew nothing about the deaths remained one of the many questions surrounding the investigation. Jolly was eventually arrested, and according to the account presented here, she was initially charged in connection with 3 deaths, while investigators continued examining the remaining cases to determine whether there was enough evidence to link her to them as well. She was also not the only person taken into custody. 2 other individuals were arrested in connection with the alleged supply of cyanide, one linked to the jewelry business and another accused of helping provide or deliver the chemical. And when the entire story is put together, that is what makes the Thomas family case so disturbing. According to the prosecution's theory, this was not simply a crime driven by one motive. Property, control, relationships, and personal ambition all appeared to play a role in the alleged plan. For nearly 17 years, the deaths had looked like separate tragedies. People saw Jolly as an educated, respectable, well-mannered woman who belonged to the family and took care of the people around her. Nobody expected that the person living inside the house could potentially be connected to what was happening. And perhaps that is the darkest part of this entire case. The threat, according to investigators, wasn't someone entering the family from outside. It was someone who had already become part of the family. After 17 years, the deaths that had once been dismissed as natural were finally being examined as pieces of a much larger and far more disturbing story.